Hello. Welcome to my channel Touching Stories. You're about to hear an amazing story about love and unexpected decisions. Enjoy watching. Fred since childhood dreamed of being a doctor. Teachers even made fun of him at school, calling him a doctor. No matter who needed help, a cat, a dog, or a classmate after a fight, he could quickly stop a bleeding and treat a wound. His only regret was that his father had died before he could grow up and learn. Fred would surely be able to help him then. His father was gone when the boy was in 3rd grade. He died of a heart attack, and since then he has been raised by his mother alone. The woman was ready to give her last word so her son wouldn't need anything. In return, he tried to live up to her expectations and brought her nothing but joy. She was never called to a meeting at school or home. Her son only brought excellent grades. Fred was one of the best students in his class. He participated in many Olympiads and came in with excellent results by graduation. No one at school had any doubts that Fred would apply to medical school, and most likely he would get in without any problems. And so he did. He became a student at the city university and a favorite of the teachers. For Berta, Fred's mother, it was a real blessing. She was proud of her son because he was the only graduate who could enter the city from a small village. At first, it was difficult for him to navigate in the hustle and bustle of the metropolis, but very quickly he got used to this rhythm. He was immediately assigned a room in a dormitory for 2. And after a couple of days, he had a roommate living with him. Unlike his classmates, Fred spent most of his time cramming. The only thing he always agreed to was camping. All other student gatherings never appealed to Fred. His roommate Sam, on the other hand, was a fan of the weaker sex and a regular at all the parties. Fred generally wondered when and how he studied, but nevertheless he seldom got a failing grade. Every time he told Fred to go to the school to clear his head, because all you've got there is cramming. You'll never meet someone like that. The one and only. You probably don't even know how to kiss in the moonlight. Do you want me to teach you? And Sam began to make a clown out of himself, hugging himself with both arms and fake, extending his lips for a kiss. To which the friend only waved off the jabber and said, "Go no longer meet, so not yet fate. And you certainly have someone to train on." He continued to gnaw at the granite of science while his classmates were having fun. All his years as a student, he was a real star in his home country and in the village. Girls, former classmates, and those who were younger, were pestering Fred's mother with questions about when he was coming for the vacations. But the woman at heart, feeling proud of her son, only laughing every time she answered them. Girls, get busy. Look around. How many guys besides mine? And there are hot. And the ring who chooses, if one of you immediately feel. But the girls managed to know right up to the minute when he would come to his mother, and from the morning they were already waiting at the bus stop. Fred didn't like it at all. He didn't have the slightest feelings for any of them. All the hustle and bustle around him was just annoying and prevented him from enjoying the quiet of his native land. In his life at this point, there was only one love for medicine. Waiting for the vacations, he wanted to be alone with his mother and nature. And there are local beauties at every turn. The boy was absorbed with his head and science and could not think about anything else. At every opportunity, he tried not to offend a maiden's pride, culturally explain, sighing that he was not yet ready for a relationship. And at the end of his vacation, he would go back to town to his favorite thing. By his age, he had time after graduation for another residency diploma and a lot of new knowledge and experience. He did not have to study further, as after the institute, the graduate with honors were ready to take almost all hospitals of the city and region. The guy turned out to be really talented, and having chosen one of the central hospitals, he began to study and work at the same time, of course. I was not a recluse and had been to parties and young people's parties over the years, but I felt awkward every time and avoided such events in every possible way. I had never met the one and only. and it was uncomfortable for him to be alone at such a party. So he fully immersed himself in work and began to live the routine. He rushed to the hospital in the morning, spent all his time with patients, then sat at books until midnight in a small room of his rented apartment. He studied more and more new ways to perform complex surgeries to save patients, developing new practices. The last of the sensational, which was written about in all the local newspapers, was an emergency operation of the deputy head of administration. The young surgeon's special merit was that he was already supposed to be home after the end of his shift, but he heard the diagnosis of the doctor on duty quite by accident. Fred questioned his decision and, after asking him to step aside, offered to double-check the test. The patient has obvious peritonitis. Not poisoning, don't you think? And all the gastric lavage procedures recommended by your colleague could lead to loss of precious time and irreversible processes. The patient, squirming in pain, looked up at his savior and said, "I understand that you are on your way home, but I beg you to save me. If you want, I'll write a receipt that I take responsibility for everything. But I demand that only you operate on me." Seeing the doctor's confusion, he decided to come at it from the other side. In a harsher voice, he said, "I hope you know who I am and what will happen if you do not help." Hearing the commanding tone in the patient's voice, Fred, as if coming to his senses, looked sternly at him and said dryly, "I don't know who you are, and what does it matter in the walls of our institution? Everyone is equal here, and I will operate because it's my case, which I'm working on, and because I'm a doctor. I do not choose who to save and who do not choose who to save and who do not. Just do my job." Fred went back to his residency and changed clothes and went into surgery. He was actually working on the possibility of helping patients with this condition at the time and asked permission from the chief physician to operate on the patient. It was a success, and Arnold, the very same operator deputy chief on his regular rounds, shook Fred's hand and said, "Forgive me for our past interactions. You are absolutely right that we are all equal before you. Doctor, if it weren't for you, I would have been washed and washed by your colleagues until I would have died." He smiled somehow sadly and continued, "Thank you very much. I owe you one. If you need anything in your family or hospital, I'm always happy to help. Of course, I'm not the head of our city yet, but connections, friends I have in every area. So I will always help. Now, I will only recommend you to all my friends and relatives." He gave me his card, letting me know that it would be a confirmation of his readiness to help. Fred, of course, was pleased. He thanked the patient and tucked the card into his robe pocket. The doctor didn't know if he could use the card, but having decided that anything can happen in life, he decided to keep it anyway. After the sensational article about the rescued deputy chief executives were ready to go to any requests, Fred, just so that someone would not poach their star surgeon from the hospital. So when he came with an application for another leave, explaining to the chief physician the desire to go to the wedding to a relative in the village, he immediately signed the document. At least listen to the leadership still had to. The chief lamented that a whole week will have to do without him, but they could not refuse. He was the only doctor who devoted himself wholeheartedly to his work, always ready to replace his colleagues and sacrificing vacations and days off. Fred had forgotten what a vacation was in his first year on the job after college. For the past few years, he had spent all his free time at the hospital on duty, on surgeries, on new research. It was now Fred's life from morning until deep into the night. Once during this time, my mother couldn't stand it and came to visit him. Managed to bring 2 unbearable bags of all sorts of homemade goodies. Just lucky that their neighbor was in town on business and helped her deliver everything in the best way. The rest of the time, he called her regularly. And the other kin who lived in their village already heard all the news of Fred's life from her. After the article was published in the newspaper, he became the pride and a real star in the village. Almost every house had that sensational newspaper about the doctor savior. Fred was against the article at all, for he had simply done his job. But a grateful patient used his connections and insisted on coming out. Going on vacation, Fred realized that he was very homesick, and this invitation to the wedding was just right. A great niece had decided to become a married lady and solemnly sent Fred an invitation card. He thought it was a good excuse for a vacation and sent off from the management and hit the road. He decided to go by the newly bought car. The foreign car was not new, of course, but quite frisky. Moreover, it had been bought from an acquaintance and should not have failed him on the way. From the first day he bought his Swallow, he loved to travel any distance. But work didn't always let him go. He liked being able to stop where he wanted to sleep, where he wanted to eat. So this time he went on his Dove. The mood was fine. A cheerful village wedding and a whole week of long-awaited rest awaited him. He immediately decided to make a quick trip for myself. So he drove without stopping. Fred thought it would be better to rest at the final line, and then only if he couldn't wait at all. But he wanted to be home as soon as possible. The weather was fabulous, and with his music playing, he admired the beauty of springtime nature. It was one of his favorite times of the year. Everything around him as if he woke up from his winter hibernation and sighed cheerful notes into the world around him. In especially picturesque places, though, he couldn't stand it and stopped to enjoy the beauty. These stops were a good excuse to stretch his legs and breathe in the clean air. For all the years, he could never get used to the city, and he still missed the pristine silence and freshness. He enjoyed every minute of it. He didn't even seem tired. After a little rest, he continued on his way. When it was a little over 70 kilometers to the outskirts of one of the residential villages, he saw a granny leaning on a cane, adapted from a branch. In front of the woman, on an overturned wooden crate, were jars of home preserves. Fred slowed down and got out of the car. It seemed very pathetic to him, this lonely old woman on an empty highway. "Good afternoon, Grandma. What are you selling? Do not regret to give away such goodies." He started talking to the old lady. As if embarrassed, quietly replied, "Yes, as long as the pension was enough, so another week to wait for the money." "Alas, son, if I do not sell these jars, my son will use them all for moonshine." Fred felt so sorry for the poor woman that he decided to talk to her some more, and continued, "Then he will also take away the money you are now earning." But the grandmother, lowering her eyes, quietly said, "So he's not here. He's drinking in the next village at a friend's place. It is now, sooner than in a week or two, will not come back. He got a pension, and that's it. I'll hide what I earn and then put it on my book in the district, or else I'll die, so even bury it will not be something to bury." Fred felt so sorry for the woman that he decided to buy a jar of raspberry jam. It was his mother's favorite. So he decided to bring her a present. The price of the jam was so low that it couldn't even pay for the cost of the empty jar. Fred pulled out some bills and handed them to the woman. The woman, seeing how much he was giving, forbade. "But something, honey, that's a lot. It's not like you took a dozen cans. Take the rest, then." But Fred, smiling, stroked his grandmother's hand and answered, "No, Grandma. You should be able to appreciate your work. Who else would you sell the rest to? And I so appreciated your precious jar. Thank you for the jam. Take care." He said goodbye and went on, putting the purchase in the trunk. Fred saw the woman wipe away her tears, crossed herself to him, and waved after him for a long time. At that moment he felt sorry for her, for God forbid something should happen to his son. He would not even know what happened to his mother. He would be busy with his buddies and drinking. Fred drove and thought how many such unfortunate grandmothers lived out their days in the middle of nowhere, and his heart felt pitifully small. But how could anyone help them except their loved one? He wanted to see his mother as soon as possible, so he decided not to stop on the way and rush home. Very fast, after covering the remaining kilometers, he left for his native land. It seemed that the area, familiar from his childhood, had undergone a major transformation, had become somehow more modern and youthful. But as soon as he turned onto Fred's home street, it was as if he was transported back many years. My mother lived in a private house, and all the neighbors were the same owners. Private property. In such streets, it was as if a completely different life was going on. Here, everyone knew everyone, and holidays or sorrows were shared, in which all the inhabitants of that particular community participated. And this time, just entering the home street, Fred got into the euphoria of the wedding preparations of his mother's brother, whose daughter was getting married. Lived 5 houses away from their house, and already from afar, you could see the bustle near their porch. In the courtyard there was a tent covered on all sides, with tables bursting with refreshments from several professional cooks. On plates set up in the courtyard, something was even being prepared and given to take to the tables. Fred himself, as a child, loved to take part in helping these cooks. He and his friends had time to try everything from the tables before they brought the trays with delicacies. And when the toastmaster invited the guests to taste the dishes, they could not even look at the food. Friends spent the whole evening lying on the lawn by the river and looking at the stars. Seeing the wedding hustle and bustle made him feel as if he had gone back many years. It couldn't be said that he had been starving for the last few years. But Fred hadn't seen such an abundance of homemade food in a long time. There was everything from delicious pies with different fillings to baked piglets beautifully decorated on huge plates. Whatever it was, the tables in the villages for such celebrations were always set no worse than the city ones. And there was not a single person who, returning from such a feast, would have been hungry. Only he parked a car in front of his uncle's house, knowing in advance that all the relatives, including his mother, would surely help with the preparations. The neighbors' daughters jumped out into the street. The 2 sisters were 1 year old, and the older one was 3 years younger than Fred. But time is of the essence, and he didn't immediately recognize the pretty girl. They were dressed in identical bridesmaid dresses. The red-headed prankster of theirs had peeped at him when he was a student mowing the grass, when he came for vacations. Apparently they had informed his mother, and in a moment she was running towards her son, throwing herself on his neck, began to sob, as if he had returned from the war. "My son, how I missed you. It has been so long since you were home." "It is good Lucy at least got married, or I do not know when we would see each other." They sat down on a bench at home, and the woman continued to whisper, "Tired from the road, let's go home, get some rest, have a bite to eat, and then go visit." But my son did not want to hear anything. It was as if his second breath opened, and he hugged his mother and said affectionately, "I have already forgotten that I have overcome such a distance. I want to communicate with everybody. I want to communicate with everybody. I want to know all the news, and at home we will have one more day of feast with you after the wedding. After all, I have a whole week off." He kissed her, and as if remembering something, went to the car. In a minute, Fred came back with a jar of raspberry jam, and somewhere he got a spoon. "Mommy, look what I found for you. Your favorite homemade at One Granny bought. You should try it. It's delicious," said Fred as he opened the jar, just as he dipped a teaspoon into the thick sweetness. Just as it jabbed into something hard and wiggled like metal, Fred, with a surprised look at his mother, put the cutlery down again and tried to scoop up the contents so that he could grab the unknown additional item. Someone from the guests who had been watching the mother and son meet and had seen everything that was going on held out a glass of water. "You take it out and wash it in water. Then we'll be able to see what's in your jar," said a neighbor standing nearby. Curiosity was getting the better of everyone in the vicinity. Fred scooped a metal object with a spoon. It is unclear how it was in the jar with jam. Put it into the water, a little rinsed it, carefully extracted in the palm of his hand. A beautiful brooch. It was obviously handmade, in the shape of a roaring bird with a feather at the end of each tail, was decorated with a small stone, like a diamond. The brooch was clearly of expensive jewelry. One of the relatives on Mark's side of the room somehow falsely shrieked, "My God, that's my daughter's brooch that went missing years ago." Isla had disappeared without leaving any coordinates. We even tried to look for her, but to no avail. The woman's voice didn't sound like that of a grief-stricken mother. She even tried to sit down in a chair and roll her eyes and ask for water. But it was somehow a lot like bad theater. In conversation, she gave the name of her allegedly beloved daughter. But other than the fact that she ran away to town and disappeared, nothing else reasonable to say or did not want to. Despite the fact that from her words past almost 5 years, she could not say anything more about her daughter, as she whispered, Fred was all incomprehensible. And it was strange that after so many years of grief-stricken mother could not find her daughter, who had gone to the nearest town. Fred was agitated and suggested, "We should try to find out something about your daughter in the village where I bought this jam. I purchased it from my grandmother right on the highway. She sold pickles, jams. So I bought some for my mom from her. But surprisingly, a minute ago, my mother, who had been killing herself, seemed to have cooled down and was already dancing around the newlyweds. The sprawling madam did not look like a grief-stricken mother. Throughout the evening, she never once again approached Fred or expressed a desire to find any trace of her missing daughter. After all, he was the one who had brought her thing. Berta and Fred sat in the home kitchen all night after the wedding reception discussing what had happened. They both came to the same thought, that it was very strange behavior for a mother who had lost her daughter. Clearly something was wrong. And Fred, in this few remaining days of vacation, decided to look into everything and on the way back to visit his grandmother on the road. Time in the countryside flies by like the blink of an eye, and it was already the hour of packing for the return trip. Mom was baking and roasting, something from the sunrise. Neighborhood friends were carrying what they could. Fred, seeing these gifts, somehow laughed confusedly. As if justifying himself, he added, "Yes, I have a good salary, and you can buy it all in the stores in town." Everybody wanted to give at least something to the fellow villager as a memento of his native land. He felt awkward refusing and wanted to stay in his homeland longer. But his patients were already waiting in the city. In addition, he decided by all means to go to that village and find an old woman who sold such precious jam. Surprisingly, the granny didn't seem to go out of her way. Ever since that day, the same jars had stood on the overturned crate, and she was still the same, leaning on her homemade staff, gazing into the distance. Fred stopped and, getting out of the car, headed straight for her. As soon as the woman got a glimpse, Fred clapped herself cheerfully on the sides. "Oh, my goodness, honey, I did not expect to see you. How did you like the jam?" As an old friend, a little quieter, she whispered, "I took your money in the morning in the district center and put on a book such money that I did not keep at home." He smiled and came closer and said, "You have a beautiful jam. Only one problem. I didn't pay much for it." He took a brooch out of his pocket and handed it to the woman. "Just open the jar, and there is such a jewel. You tell me, grandmother, where did you get such a jeweled thing? Clearly not from the cheap." The woman, is squinting with blindness and eyes, held out her hand, but just taking this masterpiece, immediately gave it back and shrieked, "See, I'm an old fool. I hid it from the alcoholic, my son, in a jar. It was given to me as a present, and then I poured the jam in it. He tried to swap everything for moonshine or vodka, so I hid what I could. It's been a long time. It's like new," as if apologizing. She looked at Fred and added, "Hiding, you see, son, succeeds. But then you don't always remember it. Why don't you find her owner yet? I don't want her in my house. Just an extra temptation for my good. Nothing, son." Fred tried to reassure his grandmother, sat her down in the car, gave her a nice cup of tea from the thermos my mother had thoughtfully given her. Her cabbage pies came in handy. Grandma, it felt like she hadn't eaten in a long time. She seemed especially thrifty, taking small bites of the pie. As if trying to stretch out her pleasure, she carefully wrapped the remaining half in a bag and put it away in her pocket. Then, after a moment of silence, she quietly began her story. A few years ago, I was just sitting there with my belongings. As a girl of maybe 17, 18 years old, got out of a passing car. But she was so confused, and the car drove away after her. She came up to me and asked how to get to town. But on that day, there was no transportation into town, so I offered her a place to sleep over at my place. My son was once again in jail, so I wanted to help. I fed the poor man and laid him on the stove. According to her grandmother, she took the girl's name. With gratitude, she handed the woman the very brooch, saying that it was all she could thank her mistress for such a prolonged stay. The old woman tried to refuse, but the lodger would not hear of it. Only when she left, she said it was very expensive for me, but not more expensive than money. If you need it, don't hesitate to take it to a pawn shop. Your help for me is much more expensive than this jewelry. You brought me back to life, and now I know exactly what to do next. Thank you, Big. They didn't see each other again, and the old lady was beginning to forget about Ayla. And if it hadn't been for the brooch that had announced itself, Fred was dumbfounded by such a story and timidly asked, where was she headed? Can you remember the city, or at least what area? To his surprise, his grandmother named his city, where he had lived all these years. He couldn't even contain the joyful sigh bursting out of his chest. Coincidence? Or maybe it was just fate that wanted him to find the owner of that brooch. He remembered the missing girl's first and last name perfectly, the wayward mother at the wedding, and now he also knew where she had gone. From this information, he was sure he would find this unknown Ayla. At this point, he immediately remembered the business card from the patient he had saved from the patient he had saved from the administration, and already knew for sure that he would help find the stranger. After all, it was not for nothing that he had offered his help in such a way, and surely in no time the missing person would be found. Saying goodbye to the mistress of the wonderful sunset, he set off for town, all the way back. All Fred could think of was how to find this girl and return her jewelry as quickly as possible. In the first days, he called his debtor and asked to meet him. He surprisingly happily agreed and invited him to lunch at a cafe. Only when he saw Fred, he stepped forward and held out his hand and said, "You won't believe how glad I am to see you. I hope very much that I can be of help to you, and I am ready to help in any way I can." Fred told him the whole story about the brooch, and begged him to find the owner of the jewel. Arnold, after taking all the necessary information about the disappearance, suggested that we forget our worries for a while and just have a friendly dinner. They had a wonderful evening and parted, agreeing to meet back here as soon as they had information. A week later, the debtor invited his savior to a rendezvous, and over dinner, told him how hard it had been for him to find his fugitive. It turned out that the girl almost immediately after arriving in the megalopolis got married and took her husband's surname. But the passion immediately faded, and in a year and a half the couple hated each other and divorced. But most likely, the change of a lot of documents stopped the girl from getting her old last name back. And so, she stayed under her former spouse's last name. By the end of the evening, Fred knew that the missing girl had since been single and living with her 5-year-old son. He was ready at the moment, having received the data to go to the address indicated on the paper, but realizing very well that time did not permit any more visits, he decided to postpone the meeting until the next morning. As soon as the new day arrived, he went to the coordinates he had received, only to press the front doorbell. He was surprised that the door immediately opened and there was a little boy on the doorstep. "Hello," Are you a doctor? And where is your robe? Mummy says she has a fever and is coughing a lot. And also Mummy holds her hands like this, and putting his little hands like this, and putting his little hands to his chest. He apparently began to show how Mummy was coughing. Fred, the same one, taking the baby by the hand, asked him to show him where his mother was lying. As he crossed the threshold of the room, he immediately realized that the woman had a fever and was delirious, unconscious. As a student in general medical practice, he knew how to help in such situations. Immediately he went to the nearest pharmacy, but on the way he decided to call a fellow therapist, and in half an hour he began the serial treatment of the patient. All day long he poked and prodded with the necessary injections. And by nightfall her temperature had already gone down. Only when she opened her eyes did she ask in a weak voice, "Who are you? How did you get here?" Seeing her son fallen on the chair next to her, she tried to get up. "Rich, he needs to be moved to the crib." "How long have I been lying here?" "What has he been eating?" But Fred put the woman down on the pillows and tried to calm her down. "You have a wonderful son. He showed me where your cereal was, and we made porridge. But he said you make it tastier, and he refused to go to bed. He said he would guard his mother. I'm Fred the doctor, but I'm not here on call. I'm here because of this piece of jewelry." He took a brooch out of his pocket and handed it to Ayla, saying, "Your mother told me you ran away and she didn't know where. I don't think she was too upset, though. Perhaps you could tell us the reason for running away." Not trying to hold back her tears, the girl replied emotionally. "What kind of hold back her tears?" The girl replied emotionally. "What kind of mother is she to me? I don't remember my parents. The nannies at the orphanage said that someone had dropped me off at the door of the orphanage in a basket with this brooch at the bottom." Ayla, trying to calm down, began to tell me how she and after a while 2 other orphans were taken in by foster parents. The same lady who was at the wedding and her deadbeat hubby. They did it so they could live off the child support. The wretched father very rarely took to the market to sell what was grown on Ayla's property, and the 2 foster brothers, Dan and Ben, the so-called parents, used as free labor. They had several greenhouses and a huge 10-acre vegetable garden. All this required care and was entirely on the poor orphans. Ayla also had to do the cleaning, and as she grew older, she had to be ready for all the members of the family. Mother and father only walked around with a businesslike look and supervised the children's work, coming up with punishments for disobedience. The salvation from this bondage for Ayla was, at the time, falling in love. She happened to meet David, who happened to be passing through their village. When one day Ayla came to the favorite place of all the village youth, on the square in front of the club, from far away, she heard an unfamiliar but very beautiful singing with a guitar. It was a visiting rocker in whom it was impossible not to fall in love. The leather jacket, badly worn jeans, and dark, thick hair gathered in a ponytail gave David a kind of brutality. There was a spark between Ayla and that handsome man. As she was leaving, he persuaded her to run away. But the girl couldn't go with him at this point. There were only a few final exams left in school. So she promised to come as soon as she got her diploma. David left her the address of his rented apartment in the city and said he would wait for her. The girl, falling head over heels in love with the visiting musician, could not wait for the last call. As soon as the cherished crusts were in her hands, she went after her beloved. Ayla understood that her parents would not let her live a normal life, and she would spend her life wasted on them. She took only the bare essentials and her only precious brooch and hit the road. She had to hitch a ride on a train. The money she had saved was only enough for half the trip. It was then that she stopped to stay in a roadside village, and with a very kind and responsive grandmother. It was she who helped in difficult time. So Ayla wanted to give her the most precious thing she had. The girl was tiredly silent, trying to catch her breath. Fred helped her to a couple of strokes of water and carefully readjusted her pillow. He laid her on the bed again. He already thought that by closing his eyes, Isla had fallen asleep, but she continued. The biker's love was short-lived. He was 5 years older than me and all his friends. Acquaintances didn't take me seriously, but I didn't care about that. The most important thing was to be with my beloved. Very soon I found out that I was pregnant, and I told David about it. To my surprise, instead of being happy, he started to talk me into having an abortion. Isla stopped talking and looked away from her tear-filled eyes. She calmed down a little and told me that from that moment on their life was no longer peaceful. David started going away more and more often, coldly informing them that he would be gone for so many days. Ayla, afraid to ask where he was. He wasn't going to explain. They began to live as if they were two strangers under the same roof. The relationship lasted a little over a year, and as soon as her son was born, her lover left a note with a request not to look for him. He said goodbye and then disappeared into a crowded city. It was good that he thought of leaving some money under the note. Isla grinned sadly. Yeah, for the first 6 months he sent me pennies. But Rich and I had enough. Then I got him a job at the daycare center, and I started babysitting there myself. At least it was near the suburbs, and I didn't have to think about food. The good-natured cooks take pity on me. So even if there's anything left over, we can take it home with our son. Fred was outraged to learn that in all these years, the mother, who was picture perfect at a wedding in the village, bemoaning the disappearance of her daughter, had never once tracked her down. This sneaky lady did not allocate a penny to her foster daughter from the allowance she received. All she could do was reproach her for everything. All the best things went to the man she loved, and the orphans were so. They were called, the new parents relied only on bread and potatoes and occasionally some gruel. The mother kept saying that they didn't earn more than that. It was a good thing that the school was supposed to provide free lunches, which seemed like a holiday for the poor children of this family. Fred was learning more by the minute about the life of poor Isla, and at some points he was ready to kill the negligent parents. It was fortunate that the distance was far, and he did not want to get his hands dirty. Fred got up every day to check on his new acquaintances. Rich was no longer embarrassed by him at all, and when he heard the bell on the door, he happily drove, rushed to meet him. He could sit in a man's arms for hours, refusing to come down. Isla, smiling, warned the baby to leave his uncle alone. He's tired from work, and you're hanging on him like a monkey. But the boy, as if afraid of being deprived of the chance to snuggle up to this strong and kind uncle, clung even tighter to his shirt, and he smiled at Ayla, letting him know that all was well, and stroked Rich affectionately on the head. Isla was on the mend very quickly and soon went to work. She was very afraid that now that Fred had given her the brooch and cured her, they might not see each other again. This made her very sad. After all, she and Rich had gotten used to their unexpected savior during this time. But what was her surprise when a couple of days later, coming out after work at the garden gate, she saw Fred. Rich, letting go of her hand, happily ran towards her, and a minute later was in the arms of a man. He, holding the baby, was trying to put aside the bouquet, so as not to break the delicate plants. When Ayla approached them, Fred held out the flowers confusedly and said quietly, "I'm sorry I couldn't come. It was hard duty these days, but I realize one thing clearly. I can't survive another day without you. Let's move back to my place that just recently allocated excellent housing. There is even a separate room for this fighter," and he tossed a few times in the air, pouring with laughter at the boy. Then, placing him on the ground, he took Isla by the arms and, afraid to hear him say no, asked quietly, "Well, do you agree?" The woman, afraid to cry from happiness, silently clung to the man who had become so dear and close. "Of course I agree. I agree, and it seems to me that we can't live without you either." Fred stayed at Ayla's that night, and after dinner they happily packed their things. Even though there didn't seem to be much, it took them a week to pack. During this time, Fred managed to finish repairs in the new apartment, and he was looking forward to becoming a family. Even at work, they began to notice that the doctor seemed to glow from the inside. It was as if he was replaced. No, he had always been sociable, but he had never been seen so happy before. All became clear when, after a while, there was a thin wedding ring on the doctor's hand. The first person to notice it was Sam's former classmate, the joker from the dorm. He had been working in the neighboring department and often dropped in to chat with his friend. Grabbing his friend's hand, with a glittering ring, he pretended to be indignant. "How can I consider you a friend after that? He got married in secret, and we have no idea. And I think something my colleague began not to walk and fly around the hospital, and it turns out he's in love." Fred, extending his hand, embarrassedly replied, "Look, I'm sorry, but Ola and I decided to do everything without a fuss. We just went and got married and had dinner at home. That's all. Especially Rich, Ayla's son, and now he's too young for noisy parties. So there you go, but we'll take you out to dinner sometime." He clapped his hands and exclaimed enthusiastically, "So her name is Ayla. And she, or rather, I'm sorry, you have a son as well." "No, I definitely want to see the witch who was able to fall in love with our Buku. I don't want to hear any rejections. Tomorrow after work, my new girlfriend and I will arrive at your place to meet you. We owe you champagne, and you owe me champagne. I hope your wife knows how to make it." Without waiting for an answer, he turned and waved goodbye and left for his compartment. Fred knew that if his friend was up to something, no one would stop him. It remained to be resigned and wait for visitors. He told Ayla in the evening after work, and she was overjoyed. "That's wonderful. So we really haven't invited anyone from that job to our party. I have no one in the city, no relatives. I haven't made any friends yet. And you, about yours, did not tell." Hugging her husband happily, Ayla, not giving him the same word. She continued, "I'm just in the first shift tomorrow, so everything will be ready for you when you come." She began to look in the refrigerator and the kitchen cupboards, and in a few minutes she had announced to her husband the menu for the holiday table in the short time they had been living together. Fred already knew that his beloved could make regal dishes out of nothing. She was especially good with pies and all kinds of baked goods, and from potatoes she apparently, in her hungry childhood, learned to make 150 dishes. The guests who came the next day were charmed by Fred and Sam. Ayla quickly found a common language, and for an hour they were chatting like old girlfriends. Sam caught the moment when he and Fred were alone, and with feigned envy in his voice, whispered, "Tell me, where did you get such a smart and beautiful girl? Although I think I also met my unique. But I'm very happy for you, my friend. Your house is filled with comfort and love, and the boy is very smart, and he won't leave you alone." They looked at Andrew, who was enthusiastically dealing with the fire engine, brought by Sam and Joy. Only this toy was able to distract him from playing with it, which he almost didn't catch. It was as if the boy was making up for lost time, trying to get as much male attention as possible. The evening went just fine, and parting, Sam made the host promise that next time they would all meet at their place. Thereupon they parted. After closing the door, they went to tidy up the kitchen. At one point, Fred saw Ayla turn pale and sit down on a chair. Fred's heart nearly jumped out of fear. He rushed for water, frightenedly muttering, "Ayla, what happened? Where does it hurt? You don't feel well. Drink some water. Let me take you to the bed." But she took a sip of water, kissed her husband, and in a mysterious voice said, "Don't, my love. Don't do anything. Now everything will pass. It is normal. It is normal in my position." She looked at her husband, smiling. He froze for a minute, then apparently began to understand her hint, and drank a glass of water brought to his wife. In a trembling voice he asked, "That's what I'm thinking. I will soon be a father." Without waiting for an answer from his beloved, He grabbed her in his arms and began to whirl around the kitchen. The fleeing Rich jumped and shouted, "Like me, like me, like me, like me, like me. I want to be held too." Fred gently set his happily laughing wife on the floor and picked up his son and began to toss him to the ceiling. At this moment, it seemed that the happiness of this family was not just an apartment, but an entire house, an entire city. The full conclusion of a happy evening was Rich's merry cry. "Daddy, Daddy dear, higher throw Daddy. Come on, I'm an astronaut." From that day on, he couldn't call Fred anything else but Daddy. And for him, it was the biggest reward and happiness. Now every free minute, the happy family went for a walk in the park, which was located right outside the house. The husband dusted off his sweetheart and adored his son. It increasingly seemed to him that it was his and only his son. The happy family could spend hours feeding the birds in the park. And when the weather was good, Fred and Rich would go jogging. Isla, stroking her already visible tummy, talked to her son. She had already been told that it was going to be a boy, and the woman now tried to tell him every chance she got about what was going on around him. One day, when her favorite men were playing ball in the park, she decided to sit down on a bench and wait for them. The weather was beautiful. The spring sun was warming the ground, and Isla, closing her eyes, put her face to this warmth. "Excuse me, please." There was a quiet female voice. "May I ask where you got that brooch?" Isla opened her eyes and saw a short, neatly dressed woman. She was staring at the brooch that Fred had returned to Ayla. She now always wore it on her clothes as a talisman that gave her happiness. She touched the brooch with her hands. Isla continued to stare silently at the stranger before she could even utter a word. She was already listening to the woman's story. Taking a handkerchief from her small purse, she wiped away her tears and said, "There is no other brooch like that in the whole world. My late father made it. He was a famous jeweler. I've seen you here several times, and I was afraid to come closer. You see, I was a young green girl, and I fell in love with a guy who was much older than me. And married. An affair ensued. Got pregnant. By that time, my parents were dead, and I had no one to rely on. I realized that my lover didn't need this child, and I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to bring up children by myself. Isla was afraid that the stranger would faint. She began to call her husband. He began to call her husband. Grabbed his son in his arms, immediately sensing something wrong, and came running to the bench. He immediately realized that the woman felt unwell and asked about pills. "Do you have any heart pills with you?" She only nodded, trying to hold out her purse. The medicine was in a separate purse. It was obvious that the mistress had been running to them often. Fred wanted to call an ambulance, but the woman asked in a weak voice, "Please don't. I have it happens. It will pass." She waited a little and continued her story as if she feared that Ayla would leave before she had finished listening. "I've been preparing for this step for a long time. But as soon as the baby was born, afraid to get attached to her, I put her in a basket that I found in my parents' apartment and dropped it on the doorstep of the hospital. Believe me, I have regretted this action not once. And the same picture I dream at night. When I decided to take my daughter, I was told that she was taken into the family. Leaving the baby, I wanted to leave at least something to remember our family. So I put this brooch under her diaper." The woman timidly touched the gold jewelry on Ayla's coat. The stranger was silent, and only by the shudders of her shoulders was it clear that the woman was crying. After she calmed down a little, she looked at Ayla with such a pleading look that the girl wanted to hold her to herself, but something restrained her. So she asked, "And where was that?" For the first time ever, the stranger seemed glad to be able to continue the conversation, and without stammering, she named the district center where the orphanage was located. Isla got a lump in her throat, as if her husband felt it, took his wife by the hand, and quietly asked, "Sweetheart, can we go home? You mustn't worry, mustn't you?" But she calmed her husband down and tried to gather her thoughts. After all, her mother was sitting opposite her now, and for the first time, she could not understand her feelings. She kind of wanted to throw herself on her mother's neck and tell all the horrors of her childhood. On the other hand, she felt resentment for having abandoned her. The woman, apparently understanding her confusion, sat silently with her eyes down and prayed to God and her found daughter for forgiveness. Fred then already knew that his beloved would certainly forgive her mother. After all, to her, it was the only soulmate she had. Well, not counting him and Rich, of course. And so it happened. An hour later, they were all sitting together in the kitchen of the apartment, and Ayla and Melcida could not get enough of talking. Fred, realizing that there was much more to discuss, got carried away with the game and went into the room with his son. The women sat up to midnight, telling each other all the stories of their lives. They cried and laughed and hugged each other and talked without stopping. During that evening, Ayla learned that her mother had married a very successful businessman years later, unlike her daughter who had been sent to an orphanage. She didn't need anything. A huge house, trips abroad to resorts, almost once every 6 months, social parties, dresses, and diamonds. But this did not bring happiness. God had not given me more children either. It was a sin to complain. Her husband loved her very much and was ready to do anything to make his wife happy. At some point he began to notice how she suffered when she saw the little ones at the playground. She could spend hours watching them from the sidelines, and then spent the whole evening in tears. Her husband even once offered to take a child from the orphanage. And she cried all night. In the morning she timidly said she agreed. That day he went on a week-long business trip and kissed his wife. As a farewell, he promised on his return to go immediately with her to get the baby or babies. His last words were, "My love, I have always trusted you in everything, so you can begin to find our baby while without me. After all, whoever you fall in love with will surely fall in love with me." Every night her husband called to see how things were going. Within a week, Melcida had been to the shelter twice and was very much looking forward to her husband's return. But life made a difference here too, the day. Before she returned, the man had burst a blood clot the night before, and in the morning she was told he was no longer there. A colleague with whom they shared a room called and stammered, mixing words, to say that he had just been taken. She, not even allowing for the worst of it, blurted it out. "What hospital is he in?" "I'm on my way out of the airport now. Will you pick me up, please?" But the male voice on the other end of the line instantly dashed all her hopes. "Your husband is gone." They took him to the morgue. "Of course I'll meet you, but you can't fly on your own right now. My assistant will pick you up in the morning and fly you directly to your destination. I'll meet you there. Hold on, please." She had no memory of the journey to the strange city. How she made it through the morning was a mystery. It was good that her business colleagues took care of all the funeral arrangements. For her, it was some kind of horrible dream, which she seemed to be watching from the sidelines. The day her husband was gone for her life literally stopped. More precisely, it was divided into before and after. Before that terrible day, she was happy and believed that very soon she would experience, albeit belatedly, the feeling of motherhood. I hope to redeem that long-standing mistake. Her whole life after her husband's death became like a mediocre black and white movie. She stopped having colors. Her mood became uninteresting and monotonous. At first, after the funeral, the woman still thought about having a baby, but friends and acquaintances dissuaded her, citing her age and health. So she decided to put an end to the matter. The woman had already decided that she would live out her life alone. The huge house seemed empty and cold to her, but she accepted her fate until she saw a familiar brooch gleaming in the sunlight on the lapel of the coat of a pregnant woman in the park. Melcida could not believe that God had given her such an encounter at her old age. She knew for sure there could be no such brooch. This jewelry was the only one, except that it could have been appropriated both at the orphanage and in the future. The daughter could have sold it or pawned it. After all, the brooch was top-grade gold with small diamonds all around the edge. Yet she felt it was her daughter's. A mother's heart could not deceive. She began to come every day to the park where she first saw the woman, and all day long she waited for her to come. When there was no doubt left, she became afraid to approach her and start a conversation. She was very afraid that her daughter would not forgive and would refuse to even talk. There was such confusion and fear in her soul that she even decided to go to church. It was the priest who was able to convince Melcida that God was giving her a chance to find her daughter, and she was still in doubt. The next day, there was a meeting in the park, and everything fell into place. From that moment on, they saw each other every day. Melcida happily walked with Rich while Isla did her chores at home, and the baby very quickly began to call her Grandma. There was so much unspent love in her that she was ready to give and give it every second to her new family and loved ones. Fred Rich, in turn, often visited the huge 3-story mansion, ran around and marveled at how cozy and homely it was. When Ayla was just weeks away from giving birth, Melcida invited them to visit, supposedly for pies, and they were delicious indeed, and Rich could eagerly eat several of them at once. When everyone was already satiated and finished their tea in a quiet, firm voice, she began a conversation. My beloved family, my only children. I have been thinking about it for a long time since the first day I met you, but I didn't know how to begin. You understand that I don't need this huge house alone, and it's sad for me when you're not here. You and your children will need the life outdoors. Quiet. Clean air near the lake is something that just needs little kids. So I suggest you move in with me. As if afraid that they will refuse, she quickly continued. Don't you think I will never interfere with your private life? We have a separate entrance to the house with our own kitchen and bathrooms. There are 2 spacious rooms. My husband specifically built this part of the house for guests. He loved to spend the holidays with his friends. That's why I'm happy to go in there, to move in right now. Then she smiled mysteriously and added, I really believe that you will agree, and I even prepared 2 children's bedrooms on the 2nd floor next to your bedroom. After all, if something doesn't suit you, you can always go back to your apartment. Fred thanked her and asked for time to discuss things at home. This made the landlady a little sad, but Fred left and reassured her, You mustn't worry too much. You're right about something, about fresh air, about space and peace. I know it's hard for you alone to live in a house like this. I think, if anything, I will be able to talk with my beloved and very clever wife. He slyly winked at her and kissed his wife, to which the latter, laughing in response, muttered, Such a sycophant. He's probably already decided everything, and even persuade me to it is not difficult. Just a day later, when she came to them to take her grandson for a walk, with excitement in her voice, she timidly asked, Isla, daughter, did you talk about moving? To which Isla smilingly replied, I have a secret to tell you. My men have even started packing for the move. Melcida sat down on the porch in the hallway and cried silently. They were tears of joy, and she now understood that life was beginning again, and she still had much to do. Her daughter and grandchildren needed her now. The move was exciting for everyone. Rich was carrying his toys to the car. Fred was fussy, trying to keep Isla away from everything. Good thing Sam, a faithful friend, came at the first call to help, and he and Fred, making several trips, carried boxes and suitcases. Sam, once in the palace, as he said, was not shy in his emotion, and marveled at everything he saw, from the beautifully shaped door handles to the dishes and furniture. He asked the landlady's permission and immediately examined every nook and cranny of this huge house, and had even looked for a room for himself when he was to visit. When all the essentials had been moved and Ayla and her mother laid a sumptuous dinner, Sam and he could not help himself, and clasping his hands to his chest. Wow! If I had known that they would be fed here like in a restaurant, I would have immediately, and my beloved would have asked for 3 days, until I would have eaten everything not left. But alas, I will have to choose what will fit in my size 52 belly, or stretch it to in front of you to a size 56. They had a great time. Sam was cracking jokes as always, and Melcida was happy, laughing. She had already forgotten the last time she had had so much fun and happiness that evening. She was truly happy. Her house smelled like delicious food, just like before, and there were loved ones and people around the table chatting. A few days later, when Fred was at work, Ayla's water began to break. She didn't even know how it happened, but she screamed, "Mommy, Mommy, hurry up and call an ambulance. I think I'm going into labor." And Melcida immediately dialed an ambulance and Fred. She was so worried she felt as if she were giving birth herself. When she heard Ayla call her mom, she was ready to fall at her feet and thank her for forgiving her. But they were both not concerned about that. She just sat beside her daughter and prayed that everything would go well. "Will you please look after Rich while I'm in the hospital?" Ayla asked as she got into the ambulance. She crossed her eyes at her and held her grandson against her chest and said, "Come on, my daughter, of course. How can I not even look after my grandson? Yes, Rich, you and I will stay here on the farm while Mother goes to get her little brother." Ayla watching her son hug his grandmother with his head on her shoulder. "Got it, you can be perfectly calm." Fred rushed straight from work to the maternity hospital and didn't leave until the nurse came out and told me. "Well, you restless papa, run home and rest. Your son weighs 454 centimeters. He's a big boy." Fred kissed the elderly nurse and rushed home. And Melcida, in spite of the late hour, and it was well past 0, sat in the kitchen waiting for news, not alone but with Berta, Fred's mother, who had come to visit on such an occasion. When the happy father came in the house and reported all the parameters of the newborn, they cried, "What about you, moms? You're getting all mushy at the slightest sign. Everything is fine. And now you have 2 grandchildren. In fact, I just remembered I haven't eaten anything since lunch." "Oh." Melcida wiped away her tears and rushed to heat up dinner. Ayla's labor went quickly and without complications, and in a few days she and the baby were back home, in a room decorated with balloons of blue and white. Everything was prepared for the new inhabitant of this beautiful home. There stood a beautiful cradle that Melcida had chosen herself. Fairy tale characters and merry animals were painted on the walls. There was a final table, a dresser full of baby things, and a sofa in case someone had to be on duty with the baby. Fred still laughed when every time I left the baby store, I would pile his car under the very roof. He teased, "You probably blew all your savings on Alex." Cheerfully laughing, I answered, "Don't worry. I have 5 more grandchildren left. You just have time to give birth." She could not help but rejoice that now the house was full, and every day she could hear children babbling and laughing. After a while, Berta went home. No matter how much they tried to persuade her to stay, she couldn't just leave the farm. But she promised to think about moving. Young people did not make her wait long. And just a year after the birth of their son, the family learned that they could soon be expecting Kate. So it was decided that I would name my daughter. Good news attracts good news. So thought Melcida, and Fred, who was appointed chief physician of the hospital, was in complete agreement with his mother-in-law. And Berta, having finally sorted out her affairs, moved into their cottage. Ayla, On the other hand, when she found out that she was going to have a daughter, said happily, "Now we'll have a brooch to pass on to."